Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. The European Commission's 2019 Strategic Outlook for the first time described China as a cooperation partner, a market competitor, and a systemic rival. This is often cited as the origin of current tensions between Europe and China. The mistrust that began in 2019 was reinforced by the Russia-Ukraine war. In the last 5 years, the mood among European leaders has swung to de-risk, moving investments and supply chains away from the world's second largest economy. Beijing's assessment of Europe has also shifted, with President Xi being openly critical of Europe's trade protectionism and its current diplomatic stance. Joining us today to discuss the state of Europe's ties with China and where they may be heading is Janka Oertel. Janka is the director of the Asia Program and a senior policy fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations, popularly known as ECFR. She writes extensively on EU-China, US-China relations, Asia-Pacific security, and emerging technology. Her latest book was published in 2023, and if I remember any of my German lessons from years ago, the title translates to End of the China Illusion, How We Must Deal with Beijing's Claim to Power. Janka, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Shibani, and great translation. I think your German skills are fantastic.
Thank you so much. Janka, before we jump right in, the previous episode that I recorded was with our colleague Helena, and that was on sort of the domestic drivers of China's policy. But we did end on this note of Europe-China ties and sort of Europe's outlook at de-risking from China. So this conversation sort of picks up from there, and I think it'll be an interesting sort of double feature for our listeners. Like I mentioned in my introduction, President Xi visited 3 European countries in May this year, and this was his first trip to Europe in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, China was considered a major investment destination for Europe, but a lot has changed since then, significantly the war in Ukraine. I was reading a commentary published by Chatham House, which points that while there was some warmth in the reception of President Xi in the 3 countries that he visited, reconciliation on the economic as well as the diplomatic front may not be as straightforward. So, what are some of the sources of this tension that have kind of affected Europe's relationship with China?
Maybe we can even wind back a little bit more than 5 years. Maybe we'll go to 10 years ago. 2014 was the first visit that Xi Jinping paid to Germany. He was in Berlin giving a big speech in Berlin. And it was the first time that a Chinese president was not only giving a speech of that sort, but that it was also live streamed, that he was willing to answer unscripted questions on stage. And it did seem in that room that there was something new going on, that there was a very new style of leadership coming, that there was an opening. And I think there were a lot of thoughts in the room in Berlin that was like, oh, there's something new happening, but there's something in it for us. This is good for us. The relationship will continue to flourish. Over the entirety of the reign of Chancellor Merkel for 16 years, Germany-China relations were incredibly positive. They were going in the direction of complementarity. We were good at exchanging the kinds of goods that each side needed. There was enormous scale in the Chinese market. And some of the companies that you spoke to at the time saying it was almost like the companies were drunk. It was almost like drug addicts that were getting all of the good stuff from China. They couldn't stop. And during the 10 years that followed, we have seen that kind of relationship develop in a very different direction now. And I think this is where it becomes incredibly interesting. 2019 was that watershed moment that you've mentioned. It actually started even a bit earlier than that, because already in 2017, the Party Congress, people could literally hear what Xi Jinping was planning to do. And that was actually something that should be quite concerning to Germans and to German companies, because it was about actually challenging particularly Germany's role in the industrial supply chain, Germany's leadership role in kind of high technologies and in manufacturing and in machinery goods and in the chemical sector and the automotive sector. So all of the things were already said, but it really didn't dawn on policymakers and on business leaders until quite a bit later. And so if we now fast forward to then see, like, we're still super positive 10 years ago. And I think it's important to show that in the whole kind of time frame of it, because it's such a short time frame that we're talking about. Within 10 years, we have a full 180 on European-China relations, where politics is pushing for more and more engagement in 10 years ago. And then 5 years ago is sort of saying, oh, maybe we have to be a little bit more careful about this, to now the full de-risking strategy going on, trying to stop businesses from getting even more deeply and deeply embedded into the Chinese ecosystem and into the sort of Chinese market, so that the risk for Europe becomes lower. So I think this is quite astonishing if you look at the tendency that is, or at the trend lines that you've seen there. So now, if we now look at sort of what is happening right now and what we're seeing right now, that last visit that Xi Jinping has paid here was actually quite a smack into the face of the Europeans. There was a visit to France, good. That was to celebrate 60 years of diplomatic relations. It was long planned, and it was sort of reciprocating the visit that Macron paid, which was a very positive visit, which was sort of styled around trying to see, can we find some middle ground? Can we find some common ground? And maybe also sneakily, how can we position Europe between the US and China somehow, so that we don't actually become the battleground for a lot of this, and that we don't pay the price for all of this, but that actually maybe we can benefit. So there was some thinking of that going on. But the other two places that were visited, Hungary and Serbia on the sort of anniversary of the bombing of the NATO bombing of the embassy in Belgrade, was something that was intended to also show the Europeans and show to the Europeans there are other friends. China has friends in Europe. This is not a unified continent. There's not a unified voice that everyone has the same opinion about China, but actually there is a multitude of voices, and that was also the message that Xi Jinping wanted to carry home. Basically say, Europe, there's many voices, many discussions. There are some places where our business is going really well and some places where it is more difficult, but just to make sure that there was not this sort of united front that China was seeing and that China was facing, which is very different from the discussions that you currently face in Brussels.
So like you said, that there's been a complete 180-degree shift when it comes to Europe's outlook on China from 2014 to 2024. And it is happening at a remarkable speed when it comes to change in policy, because you don't see such massive shifts in such a short period of time generally. But what does de-risk from China really mean for Europe? Conceptually, it means that you're mitigating risk, you're limiting your sort of strategic dependency. But is there a policy blueprint?
So how you do risk depends on where you sit. That's a very complicated process in Europe. And it also depends on who you ask. So one of my favorite things is always when I'm in the US and then someone says, well, I spoke to the Europeans about this, then to ask, well, who? Which country, which ministry in which country, what party in which country? Because obviously there is a very different viewpoint on all of these questions depending on where you are. More broadly speaking, one can say that the European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, has signaled that, particularly in light of what we have faced in Europe with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the dependencies on Russian oil and gas have demonstrated that dependencies of that sort on countries that can potentially act against European interests is not a good idea. So it was sort of a reminder to say, look at the supply chains, and that already happened through COVID as well, when a lot of the supply chain dependencies became clear. Look at the supply chains, look at dependencies, look at risks, and carefully see if it is not better to rebalance and reshift to be careful in terms of where 95% dependencies are, and to see if that can be refocused and whether that can be reshifted. Now, companies have interpreted this very differently and countries have interpreted this very differently. Whereas some have said, all of our China exposure can potentially be a risk because it can be used against us. The Lithuania case was a very important one in that regard. Lithuania opening a Taiwan representation office, calling it by the name of Taiwan, getting the full anger of the Chinese system in return, including a full breakdown of the economic and trade relationship. And that made it very difficult because that was considered an attack on the European single market. So that's the one side of the story, is all those countries that have already been facing Chinese aggression, and they were saying, well, hang on, we shouldn't be dependent on anything, basically, when it comes to China. Other countries then are saying, just like Germany, where it's like, well, but this is really important for most of our companies. We're very dependent on the Chinese market. We're very dependent on inputs. We want to move forward the green transition. So we want to buy solar panels at a cheap price. We want to be able to have kind of Chinese electric vehicles in our market. We want to be able to benefit from the developments that are happening in China in the green tech space. So all of these developments are really important for us. And then you have other countries that are sort of saying, well, actually, we want this the other way around. We want more Chinese investment in Europe. We actually want China to build cars in Europe because that's actually good for us. It will be a different form of de-risking also vis-a-vis developments in the United States. So it's really a tricky question, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution to all of this. But what has become clear is that import dependencies are a bit easier to de-risk. So the question, do you really have to get 90% of your antibiotics from China? Do you really have to be dependent to 95% in the rare earth supply chain? These are questions that sink in quite easily with policymakers. And it's relatively clear to say, well, that may be not such a great idea. But what is much harder is the question of the export market. Is that a dependency that is equally problematic? Does that need to be de-risked as well? Now, in this case, the Chinese market is doing us a bit of a service because there's less imports from Europe that go into China. Those numbers are constantly going down. So that China is not as attractive a market as it was just a few years ago. But then there is this dependence on the Chinese market itself and the being in China and producing in China, which is relevant only for very few countries in Europe. It's particularly relevant for Germany. And that's a dependency that is politically very hard to communicate, because how German is a company that produces in China, has their R&D centers in China, pays taxes in China, reinvests in China, and actually doesn't repatriate a lot of the benefits or a lot of the income back to Europe. Is that really something where a macroeconomic dependency exists? Or is that something that a company has made itself very dependent on the Chinese market? And that's something that we're very actively debating here in Europe. Where are the limits to that? And how do you weigh the different kinds of risks? What we have done in our research is, for example, to look at the green energy supply chain and to look at green technologies and to say, what would a good risk balance for us look like? Now, probably trying to get the entirety of the solar supply chain back to Europe is not a very economical solution to the problems that we're facing. Where are areas, though, where it does make sense to refocus our energies? So if we want to take Germany again as the example, because I'm sitting in Berlin and it's very hot outside, if we want to have our energy basically to 100% from wind energy, solar energy, and hydropower, then it is probably not advisable to be dependent to quasi 100% in the solar supply chain, but also in the wind energy supply chain. This is a huge debate at the moment as Chinese turbines are slowly entering the European market for onshore and for offshore projects, are becoming competitors and can compete at price points that are 30 to 60% below other turbine producers. So these are the discussions that are currently ongoing, and where the whole kind of what does de-risking actually mean becomes a really, really tricky paradigm, and a really not such an easy catchphrase. And I think that's my biggest problem with the sentence, because it insinuates that there is this state of being de-risked. Right? It insinuates sort of, if we just drive the risk down, we're good, and that we can continue the way we continued before. But we're in a completely new world where we have to really rethink our economic model, where we have to rethink all the supply chains, and where we have to rethink trade relationships. And So I think the de-risking is a bit like sort of a soothing drug for all those that are concerned about the state of the world, and say it's not decoupling, it's just de-risking. It's supposed to insinuate sort of we're doing something that is just a minor incursion, where actually, if you take it seriously, it's quite a major shift in our policies.
So then do you think that the nomenclature of de-risking might actually be limiting how different European countries are looking at their relationships with China?
So what's always worked, and this is why also, as we call it, the Holy Trinity, the partner, competitor, rival, has been so useful, is if you find wording in Europe that everyone can agree on, it probably doesn't mean so much, right? This is usually, if you can get 27 countries to align around something, then it's probably nicely vague and ambiguous, because if it were tough and clear cut and really, then probably you wouldn't get everyone to agree on it. So that's sort of, as a rule of thumb, it usually works. And I think that was the problem with the partner, competitor, rival logic. In 2019, that was revolutionary because it included the word rival. It included the word systemic rival. This was something where the Commission really nudged and pushed the debate forward. And the fact that all 27 countries agreed to just having that word included was incredibly special. Well, 5 years later, we've moved way beyond that. And partner, competitor, rival doesn't cut it anymore. This doesn't describe the relationship that we're seeing. There's virtually no more partnership elements. There's absolutely fierce and diehard competition for survival in many industries. And the systemic rival component is becoming clearer and clearer, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Beijing's support to Moscow. So I think what we need to do is sort of slowly change the wording that we're using from the kind of the rivalry question to the de-risking question, so that it actually reflects reality better. But that will be slow on the European side, because it does mean we have to get everyone, we have to make sure that everyone sort of follows along. But these words matter. So the fact that we are talking about de-risking is an acknowledgement of the fact that there is risk. That's a good thing. So it's always accepting the wording that one has and then continuously pushing it forward, continuously nudging the debate and saying, look, does this still reflect what we actually talk about? I've always been a bit skeptical about the de-risking terminology as such, but I can see the benefits and I can see why it has sort of caught on. I mean, it was even used then by the United States, which was a bit of a problem because we used de-risk, not decouple, also sort of quietly to make our policy distinct from the United States. It wasn't actually the intention that the United States would follow in the same wording, because that makes it harder to be different from the United States, which is important to many players in Europe to say, our interests with the United States often are close, but they're not entirely aligned. We're not exactly the same. We have our own approach. And that makes it then sometimes harder when the US uses the same words that we would use.
You mentioned the partnership element sort of reducing when it comes to Europe, China. But like you were talking about earlier, there are differences within Europe. And when it comes to partnerships, if we look at the Western Balkan states, they're very keen on the Belt and Road Initiative because it brings a lot of infrastructure and development to these countries. China is using that dependency to kind of leverage its way into the EU market. So how do you see this playing out?
So the countries that are not part of the EU, but the accession countries, have received particular interest from the Communist Party and from China in terms of sort of the gateway to Europe, but also the soft underbelly that one can use, and it can be useful to have interactions with them. At the same time, economically, they're of less importance. So if you want to be cynical, you can say that Germany is actually the soft underbelly because of its economic relationship to China and its close embeddedness into the Chinese economic ecosystem, much more so than Serbia ever will be. Because in the end, it matters less to Europe where Serbia is and where Serbia lands, and even where Hungary lands, than where Germany lands on these questions. At the same time, however, the European failure to actually make a credible offer to the accession candidates has led to those countries also playing off different players against each other in a strategy that is trying to say, well, look, we can go with other players. Now, the EU has been quite good in saying, well, good luck with that. We're not going to bail you out in case you get in trouble. But obviously, that only goes so far. So I think it is about sort of living with some of these pressure points that are being posed, living with some of these incursions also into Europe from different angles. I think what we have seen is that formats like 16 plus 1, 17 plus 1, the sort of Eastern European initiative, Central and Eastern European initiative that the Chinese government has started, which was deliberately designed to sort of blur the lines between EU countries and non-EU countries, right? It's sort of 11 EU countries and the rest non-EU countries, actually trying to make sure that like this is not such a tight-knit community. After all, we can sort of break this open a little bit. That hasn't worked. It's a dead format now. It's unrevivable. People are leaving, countries are leaving the format. It's just not brought any benefits. And so I think that's in the end where for China, it will always show whether the interest is real or whether the interest is marginal and political. Only if real investment follows, which we see in Serbia and Hungary, those are the two cases where this actually has been the case, does that political relationship actually hold. But if the real investment doesn't follow, as we've seen in the Baltics or in Poland, etc., then the relationship becomes much weaker. I think this new wave of Chinese investments, this question of investments, particularly in the electric vehicle supply chain and in the electric vehicle industry, will be more challenging. We will see kind of the Italian government being interested in factories, the Spanish government being interested in factories, the French government being interested in factories. And so this is something where I think goes far beyond the question of Serbia, Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria. This is the heart of Europe. And this is in the end where all of the big economic decisions and the big questions of where does Europe fall will be taken.
We were talking about this earlier as well, that President Xi's visit sort of demonstrated a lot more about sort of the position of different economic countries on various issues. And one of the things that sort of came through this visit is that President Xi is also trying to sort of limit reputational damage that China has suffered because of the position it's taken in the Russia-Ukraine war. Equally, President Xi has also been tough on EU institutions, and if there was a translation of his statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that says EU institutions should correct their view on China, which is sort of unprecedented for China to be so critical of EU. So how are you interpreting this?
I would say the gloves are off in the relationship. The little dance that has been pulled off before, where every side tried to keep each other happy, that is no longer the case. It is a very kind of clear and slightly aggressive posture that the Chinese government is taking vis-a-vis European countries. But equally, a number of European countries have really sharpened their language, German-China strategy being one of them, which is not necessarily always followed through in policy, but the wording has significantly changed. And this is not to the liking of the Communist Party at the moment. What I find interesting, though, is that, you have to see this also from the European angle, and particularly from the Central and Eastern European angle, or those countries that particularly support Ukraine at the moment. What we are seeing is China being the strategic enabler of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine. On 4th of February 2022, when the joint statement between China and Russia was signed, the Chinese government signed off on Russian claims for a future European security order that would include a demilitarization, basically, of former Warsaw Pact states, no more NATO troops in Eastern Europe, etc. China has become a factor for the European security order. That wasn't the case before, and that has changed a lot. The fact that it's now Chinese diggers in Russia that are helping dig the trenches, that it's Chinese drones killing Ukrainian soldiers, that it's Chinese semiconductors that are powering Russian weapons, that's just something that doesn't go unnoticed. It is really hard to continue to do business as usual when something like that is ongoing. It is actually a bit astonishing that the relationship between China and Germany is still in the state that it's in, given the support that, it's almost schizophrenic if you think about all of the support that the German government is providing to Ukraine, including millions and millions of taxpayers' money, while at the same time kind of trying to stabilize an economic relationship with China that is on the other hand then financing again the war that is happening on the other side. So we're in a very delicate and difficult situation. We're even acknowledging the fact that this is what the Chinese position is at the moment, is really hard and really difficult, because what the Chinese government is trying to do and what it's trying to do with these visits and with the communication is also to blur these lines as well. China's for neutrality. China is against war. China's for peace. These are the words that you kind of that are constantly being repeated. Like, China has no role in this. It has no interests in this. Now, none of this is really true, because obviously if China were really neutral, we've seen what that would look like in 2014 when during the Russian annexation of Crimea, where the Chinese position was much different from what we're seeing now. So what we are actually facing is sort of a recalibration of the relationship, not only in the economic realm, but also in the security realm. And that's something where I think the European discussion hasn't really caught on yet, and where it is useful to have conversations with China's neighbors about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of also the security side of the conversation and not just the economic side of the conversation. I think this is slowly beginning to change Europe and European perspectives. There was, in the very early days of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, there was this belief that China would come to save us, that the road to peace in Ukraine leads through Beijing. Even in Ukraine, there was a strong belief that one had a good relationship with China. China had invested a lot in the Ukraine-China relationship, from grain exports to sort of potential technology transfer, from a good sort of existing defense industry that Ukraine had, from sort of aircraft technology. All of that, also on the Ukrainian side, there was this thinking, no, we have a good relationship with China. This cannot be in China's interest, a sentence that has so often been repeated. Whereas we have been not so great at seeing what is actually in the Communist Party's interest at the moment. And from what we can just empirically observe as we speak, and over the last basically 2 years, what we can see is that it does seem to be in the Communist Party's interest to stabilize Vladimir Putin in Moscow, to support Putin's activities, and to support this invasion, at least to the degree that it doesn't hurt Chinese interests so much, and at least to the degree that it inflicts a lot of pain and cost to the Western allies. And I think that's a reality that is incredibly hard to sink in, because it runs counter to sort of the last 30 years of the engagement, the last 40 years of the engagement with China, where China always seemed either neutral or positive vis-a-vis Europe, supporting Europe, helping Europe even during the financial crisis. So this is a real sea change, and I think we are not at the end of what that development looks like in the end.
I found it really interesting that you mentioned that Europe is now looking to sort of open conversation about being what it's like to be China's neighbor, a rival that's in sort of the vicinity, and how Europe can learn from those experiences. So if we look at the sort of strategic outlook, the de-risking policy, I would think that this has been an exercise in self-reflection for Europe. And the smaller steps within these big strategies seem to be sort of probes. So there was the EU had launched a probe into how subsidies might be unfairly benefiting Chinese makers when it comes to electric vehicles in the auto sector or wind turbines. I think there was also a probe on a solar farm in Romania. So overall, there is this emphasis now to ensure that there's a level playing field while you're aligned on development goals, regulation, as well as innovation. So how is Europe now looking at industrial policy? And maybe if you could tell us, not just in relation to China, but also just competitiveness within Europe.
So competitiveness is the new big word. We're always about big words. Competitiveness is the next big thing. That's what Europe needs to be, competitive in the future. But all of those examples that you've cited are really a really good display of what happens in Brussels at the moment. Brussels has competencies in the trade and economic policy realm, obviously has to stand a bit clearer from the security policy realm, which is changing a bit with Ukraine, but sort of generally that's the core competency of the EU is competition policy. This is how it was created. It is about sort of market entries. It's about what does trade look like. It negotiates the trade agreements for Europe as a whole. So what we have seen over the last few years is sort of Brussels slowly understanding that it actually has agency and power in this sector, and that it can develop a bit of a toolbox where it's never going to be the one size fits all super tool, but where the combination of all the little tools can actually change the dynamic of the relationship and inflict a serious amount of pain, and therefore potentially have an impact on changing policies on the Chinese side. So you've named a few of those investigations. They've kind of all taken place under different versions of trade defense mechanisms, of the question of a foreign subsidies investigation. We have a new international procurement instrument. We have an anti-coercion instrument. Now we have new forms of investment screening. It's all of these little different tools. And these little different tools mean that the EU all of a sudden can do dawn raids at Chinese companies to gather information and intelligence. It can ask companies for transparency criteria and say, what actually are you providing? Which led, for example, in a rail bid to the fact that when the EU was asking, well, please provide the information about government support, that the Chinese company pulled out entirely of the bid rather than providing that information. What we're seeing in the EV case is quite spectacular, because what the EU has created is a very differentiated and nuanced toolbox. So instead of slashing 100% tariffs on every single car that comes from China, Commission has sent investigators to China, asked very kind of European-style bureaucracy, asked for forms to be filled out, transparency criteria to be delivered on, and has asked the companies to detail their relationship with the Chinese state. And I think that's very interesting, because it's sort of a very European version of doing this, right? So this is how European bureaucracy operates. And the result of this is that those companies that didn't participate in the investigation, that were unhelpful, actively unhelpful, and not trying to support this investigation, are getting higher tariffs that are not punitive tariffs, but sort of are tariffs that are supposed to balance out the competitive advantage. And this is something where I think, if you then add all of the different things together, so that's a 38.8% as the highest rate, and then you have the 10% existing tariffs, that's almost 50%, but sort of cloaked and veiled in a very bureaucratic European process, which would have been very different also as a diplomatic response to just say, Europe is now imposing 50% tariffs on every Chinese car imported. It's not. It's sort of taking a very nuanced approach. And I think that shows how it's currently Europeans are desperately trying to preserve a degree of the old order, a degree of sort of rule of law in trade relationships, a degree of the old mechanisms, but at the same time sort of toughening up and getting ready for a reality in which all of these tools and measures are needed. And that includes industrial policy mechanisms. We're speaking on a day today. Today is the 20th of August. We're speaking on the day when the first Ursula von der Leyen is in Dresden in eastern Germany today, together with the German Chancellor. TSMC is opening its first plant. It's sort of their first digging of the first bit of dirt out of the ground. They're starting to build a factory for semiconductors in Europe with loads and loads of billions of government support. Part of a de-risking initiative, part industrial policy, part trying to get also investments into Eastern Germany. But all of this taken together shows that there is sort of an understanding that the world is changing, that greater government support in the markets seems to be important and necessary, while China and the US both are doing that. But that also, at the same time, you need to get ready for a world in where you may talk about leveling the playing field, but in which you understand and accept that the playing field is just not level, and that you have to get to a reality where you won't level it down anymore, but sometimes you just have to level up. Therefore, you have to have greater restrictions for access to the European market, which is a huge power. It's a huge force that we have, and something that can actually then have an impact. But that will also have an impact on relationships to third countries. And I think that's where we are struggling most at the moment. How do we safeguard ourselves from sort of market distorting practices from China, but at the same time maintain openness in the European market, that it becomes not a fully subsidized, not very active and very dynamic market, but that it remains a market in which, for example, in electric vehicles, Japanese, Korean, Indian, American, European cars can all compete with actually low levels of tariffs, and with hopefully low amounts of subsidies, but are protected against unfair competition from China. And I think this is sort of this is the idea right now. How can Europe become a pro-competition space again, where how it can actually live up to this ideal that it used to have, and protect itself at the same time from market practices that are designed to destroy competition?
I remember reading a quote by the Commission's executive VP, where they said that this is not a new weapon, but a new world that we're functioning in. And I think what you're saying sort of aligns and echoes with that so deeply. I think
that was Margarete Vestager, actually a speech that I would recommend for everyone to read. It's a fantastic speech that she gave at the Center for Advanced Studies, the old Oppenheimer place, where she was talking about sort of, this is not a new technology, it's a new world. It was a lot about AI. It was a lot about sort of the challenges that technologies bring. But she was also saying, that's an important part of that speech, that we have to stop this whack-a-mole approach, that we can't go technology by technology, industry by industry, because this is sort of creating the equivalent to a bureaucratic denial of service attack. We're so busy trying to regulate all of these different things that we're actually losing the bigger picture. And so she was calling for some sort of slightly bigger approach of talking about trust and trustworthiness in the relationships again, talking about environmental standard, social labor standards, cybersecurity standards, and data security standards as new criteria for how Europe should govern its relationship with other countries in the trading space. And I think that's a really important speech. So thanks for mentioning it.
Yes, we will link it in the show notes for our listeners to read later. And I mean, Janka, listening to you, I felt like we can just keep talking about the difference of views within Europe, sometimes leading to conflicting interests when it comes to dealing with China. And I would love to have you on for part 2 of this episode, where we just maybe dig into sector specific and industry specific sort of interests. But for today, before I let you go, the last question is essentially about how is Europe looking at the global South? What are some of the pathways that it's looking to collaborate, especially with India? Or simply, are there no pathways?
No, I think there are pathways, and there's a desperate kind of desire to create these pathways. So I think what we are seeing is this sort of revival of European interest in India and in collaborating with India. Now, we don't seem to be particularly great at it yet, but you can at least see that in each of the capitals, this is the big discussion, is how do we change our relationship with India in a way that it doesn't become a relationship where we're trying to replicate, it's not the second China conversation. That's not the point. But the point is, how can we benefit collectively in a world where sort of the deck is stacked against us? This holds true for India and for Europe at the same time. For India and Europe, a world in which there is sort of big powers like the US and China that are trying to change the way the trading system works, that's not very beneficial. So it's sort of about also teaming up. And that goes from sort of the question of the solar supply chain. It is about wind manufacturing. It is about market access, respective market access. It is about production and manufacturing capabilities within India. But it is about much more. It's also about Indian ideas. I think if we have all the discussions about digital public infrastructure, what can be learned from sort of the digitalization and the policies that have been pursued in India over the last few years. It is about the question of Can we get India on board for sort of fast decarbonization? What can be done and what is needed for that? How can we work together on a new kind of industrial supply chain that is more China-proof? But what can we also learn diplomatically from a country that is a neighbor and has a border with China and an active conflict, and has actually taken measures that have been quite effective in asymmetric responses to Chinese incursions? And so I think there are a lot of ways in which the India discussion is changing. The problem that we're having is that there isn't a lot of expertise in the think tank space in Europe. We do need, and I think this is what Ursula von der Leyen has kind of put into her political guidelines as her program for the next 5 years, a new kind of strategic partnership with India. But you can say that in a big speech. You want the new kind of strategic partnership. You want the Trade and Technology Council. But you have to feed that with like real life. This has to happen in a reality where companies then are actually very interested and want to go, where the flow of politicians visiting each other is significantly enhanced, where the capacity to do research and to understand the regulatory environment in India, to understand sort of the technological developments in India, where all of that is just heavily improved, and where financing is then provided also for these kinds of mechanisms to develop. You can't just say you want all of that and then hope that it magically happens. So I think what we will hopefully see over the next few years is that this sort of promise of Europe-India relations improving, that's actually kept by really, really investing in this relationship, understanding the difficulties and problems that will continue to exist, but not being sort of too focused on an FTA that is sort of part of an old world, but thinking about the potential of technology collaboration, thinking about the potential of diplomatic collaboration in the future through a different prism, and understanding that because the world has changed, that relationship between Europe and India will also necessarily change. And the fact that India's relationship to China has changed is actually opening a possibility here for Europe that otherwise wouldn't have existed.
I think I definitely agree with you that it's a very interesting time for India-Europe ties. And I think it would also require a lot of self-reflection on India's part to sort of be open to European investment in India, and, look at our ecosystem, our regulation, our markets, and see, because interests, like you said, are naturally aligned. But when it comes to the partnership and sort of functioning on a practical level, are we aligned there? And I think those are important conversations to have.
Yeah, the devil is clearly in the detail on the India-Europe relationship, and that's for sure. But I think what has been lacking over the last few decades almost has been political will to get some of this stuff worked out. And I think the political will is now slowly there where it needs to be. So the question is, can it work when the political will is there on both sides?
On that hopeful note, thank you so much, Janka, for joining us. This has been a very interesting conversation. I can say with certainty one of the few conversations on Europe-India ties that actually sort of goes deep and looks at what Europe is thinking and how it's thinking about an important neighbor for India as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.